news. The Des Moines Register is out with a brand new poll conducted by J.Ann Selzer's firm. This, as you know, is the gold standard of polling in Iowa, and it shows Vice President Harris with a 3-point lead over Donald Trump in that state. Harris has the support of 47% of likely voters to Trump's 44%. That result within the margin of error. Joining us now, pollster J.Ann Selzer.
All right. J.Ann, obviously you are bringing, we're coming on air right now with this polling, and I mean, we could just put it up on the screen for folks because I didn't have this on my bingo card, as I like to say. Vice President Kamala Harris, 47%, Donald Trump, 44%. Take us inside your poll. What is new here? We know that there's a majority of Iowa men in this poll that say they prefer Trump. A majority of women prefer Harris among likely Iowa voters. This seems like something is happening.
It does seem like something's happening. Now, we've been living with the numbers day by day as we've been gathering the data. So we've had a little bit of time to get over the initial shock. You know, Iowa is a very Republican state. There's only one person at statewide office or federal office who is a Democrat. So to have the presidential candidate lead by a substantive margin was shocking to begin with. One of the reasons she is leading is because of her strength with women generally, even stronger with women age 65 and over. Her margin is more than 2 to 1. And this is an age group that shows up to vote or votes early in disproportionately large numbers. So it's a bit of the boost that Kamala Harris has gotten this time.
You know, for me, this is very telling of a lot of the effort and the importance of a little thing called ground game. And when a campaign coming in with 107 days to make the case to communities across the country, and we know the importance of communities like ours. Iowa is a bellwether, particularly as you get closer to the election, as it is in the beginning, right? So here we are at the end. What's your take on that aspect of this, that the numbers have changed so dramatically from the 18 points that Donald Trump had to now Kamala Harris over Joe Biden, the 18 points, to now having Kamala Harris up by 3?
It's, you know, clearly there's something going on here if our poll numbers are correct. And it's the same method that I've used really since I started polling. So we have a good accuracy rate. We're comfortable with what it is that we do, which is to allow our data to reveal to us what's happening with the future electorate. So that may be the little lucky charm here, is that we're able to uncover the change that's happening on the ground. We certainly know anecdotally, as you drive around the metro area, you see far more, I guess I'd say far fewer Trump signs than we've seen in past cycles. But, you know, it's hard to put too much faith in that. So now we have some hard numbers. We'll see. I will just mention that neither of these candidates gets to 50%. So there still is some swing left to be determined on election night.
It has been fun to watch all of the folks who follow polls on Twitter try to decide what your poll means for other states. And so I wonder, when you look at white voters specifically, if you think there is something in your poll that you can extrapolate out to Michigan, to Wisconsin, to Pennsylvania.
Well, as your graphics are showing, there is clearly a gender gap there. Iowa is predominantly white, so there's not much analysis we can do on the non-white vote. But I think what it does say is that polls that are deciding that they know what the future electorate looks like may be basing it on past electorates. And in some cases, that would give Harris an advantage, and in some states, that would give Kamala Harris an advantage, or some would give Donald Trump the advantage. So we'll see how that plays out. I just feel like these numbers represent, our last poll in September had Trump leading by just a 4-point margin, when Joe Biden back in June had lost lost by an 18-point margin. So we're certainly seeing an upward, almost linear shift in the Democratic strength in Iowa.
You know, Jan, I just want to note that the only Democrat elected statewide in Iowa, Rob Sand, when your poll came out, he texted me, and Rob has been saying for a very long time, he is the state auditor, that there have been many close losses in Iowa, and Iowa is, in fact, a place that's in play for Democrats. And this poll, to me, indicates perhaps Rob Sand is right, you know, by putting in the work, infrastructure, as Chairman Steele just noted. Have Democrats made Iowa more competitive because of their presence there, and also the issue of reproductive rights? Because that was something that bubbled up on the ground throughout the state, namely led by the governor herself.
Right. Well, I would mention that Rob Sand is that one Democrat elected statewide. So he's got his finger on the pulse of what's happening in the Democratic Party. As we were trying to determine, you know, this is a very short poll because there's no time left to write lengthy stories with lots of data in them. So we don't have as much data as we might like about why this is happening. But our consensus from the reporters who work this beat is that the 6-month abortion ban went into effect just this past summer. And so I think as Iowans are starting to see the consequences of that, I think it has gotten people interested in voting. The thing we noticed in our September poll that shrunk Trump's lead by 14 percentage points, he lost no actual ground. He had as many respondents supporting him in September as he had in June, but the size of the likely voter pool had increased, and most of that 85 respondents went to Kamala Harris.
So Jan, let's talk about sort of the why, because that's the world I like to live in as a former party official. Is okay, why are voters doing what they're doing? Organization, as we just talked about, you and Simone, you know, that sort of planning that is all good and smart. It's all critically important. But the why narrative tells us a lot of the inside thoughts of the voters. And there are two aspects of the messaging here that feeds into the why. For the Trump people, the narrative that they tried to get up and out in front of voters was, are you better off, right, than you were 4 years ago? For the Harris campaign, it was a different kind of approach. It was, okay, I want you to size the two of us up, and you tell me which one you think is going to be better suited to take care of the nation's interests over their own. And I'm curious as you look at them, I'm sure you're going to peel back on these numbers a little bit more, but do you get a sense of the why in that space that the voters looked at the messaging here as a way to sort of the carrot that led them to where we are right now?
Well, I think that question about are you better off, that people tend to think, well, that's your pocketbook. There are other ways that people are not better off. And again, I go back to the Dobbs decision and the 6-week abortion ban, which put women of childbearing age into a danger zone. Some might feel it's that way. The thing I need to point out, and it was pointed out to me by one of the Register reporters, is that this change, I think, is largely organic. That is, the presidential campaigns haven't visited. They're not putting money into this state. So that it's not that this is something that has been created by the campaigns themselves. I think was largely written off, which is why this poll is such a surprise. So I think there's something more organic that people are deciding for themselves. This is the time I'm going to get off the bench. I'm going to show up, and that it appears from my data that is happening more on the people deciding to vote for Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate.
Well, as a former pre-med student at Johns Hopkins University, I appreciate organic chemistry. Jan Seltzer, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Tonight, Vice President Kamala Harris is delivering a dire warning to Americans who might still be on the fence about who to vote for on Election Day.
This is not someone who is thinking about how to make your life better. This is someone who is increasingly unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and the man is out for unchecked power. And in less than 90 days, it's either going to be him or me in the Oval Office.
Now, this comes as we see Donald Trump on defense after using what little time he has to deliver a closing message to attack former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming.
It's a fake news, and they're trying to make something out of it, and it's so biased to start off with. And all I'm saying is she was a nutty war hawk. You know, she wants to go to war with anybody that moves and lose a lot of people, lose a lot of soldiers, put the nation in trouble.
Now, I want to play the comments that sparked intense backlash. Here is Trump speaking at an event in Arizona with Tucker Carlson on Thursday.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. You know, they're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy. But she's a stupid person.
Trump maintains that he was simply criticizing Cheney for being a war hawk. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays, slightly different interpretation. She has announced an investigation into Trump's comments as potential death threats against Liz Cheney. It is no wonder Trump's remarks have been so divisive. After all, he has regularly used violent rhetoric to talk about his perceived adversaries. And this comes as we are learning more about secret plans for a MAGA takeover of the federal government if Trump reclaims the White House. Like most things in Trump world, it all leads back to Project 2025. Earlier this week, ProPublica and Documented released a report which uncovered shocking videos of private speeches delivered by this guy, Russell Vought. He is a chief Project 2025 architect and the president of the far-right think tank, the Center for Renewing America. Watch.
We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. We want, when they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down so that the EPA can't do all of the rules against our energy industry because they have no bandwidth financially to do so. We want to put them in trauma. We're trying to build a shadow office of legal counsel so that when a future president says, what legal authorities do I need to shut down the riots, we want to be able to shut down the riots and not have the legal community or the defense community to come in and say that's an inappropriate use of what you're trying to do.
Vought, who has remained a close ally of Trump since leaving government, went on to call these plans a response to the, quote, Marxist takeover of the United States. He also likened this moment in history to 1776 and 1860, you know, when the U.S. was at war or on the brink of war. This is the extreme framework Vought and MAGA leaders are pushing over and over and over again. And there is good reason to believe that this is much more than just rhetoric. Back in August, ProPublica and Documented shared previously unpublished training videos training future political appointees in a hypothetical Trump administration and offering advice on how to change the way the federal government functions. According to a ProPublica review, 29 of the 36 speakers featured in that training video or those training videos have worked for Trump in some capacity. And then there's everything we have heard from Trump himself. According to an NBC News review of Trump's public comments, he has called for the criminal prosecution of 16 politicians, 15 law enforcement, military, and intelligence officials just since he entered the 2024 race. He has also threatened the prosecution of workers of federal public health agencies, tech billionaires, and basically anyone who engages in what he has called, quote, unscrupulous behavior. But the question is, could Trump actually carry out unprecedented prosecutions? Well, NBC News asked current and former Justice Department and FBI officials and a group of legal experts that very same question. And they all said, yes, there are ways around the guardrails, even though doing so would shatter half a century of post-Watergate norms in this country. For starters, a new president appoints about 300 senior Justice Department officials, including powerful positions in U.S. attorneys who ultimately run offices across the country. All 300 of those appointees must be confirmed by the Senate, but multiple former officials said they fear Trump would install partisans who are willing to do his bidding. According to ABC News, one of the names on a draft list of people Trump might nominate as Attorney General is, you might recognize her, U.S. District Judge Aileen Cannon. She is the one who, of course, threw out the classified documents case against him in Florida. Also on the list, this guy, Jeffrey Clark, a mid-level Justice Department official who backed Trump's claims of 2020 election fraud. Of course, you'll remember that days before the January 6th insurrection, Trump attempted and luckily failed to install Clark as the acting attorney general at the time. And speaking of acting attorney generals, Trump's more hardline advisors have discussed appointing a series of them since they wouldn't require confirmation from the Senate. In fact, under current federal law, an acting attorney general can serve up to 210 days at a time. And it doesn't end there. One of Trump's more far-reaching proposals, Schedule F, calls for the reclassification of about 50,000 civil servants across the federal government. In other words, they could be hired, promoted, and fired at the whims of Donald Trump and his inner circle. Even if Trump never took action on Schedule F, officials and experts said the likely outcome of this level of upheaval would be an even more extreme version of the chaos and legal battles that marked his first term. So what is the big takeaway here? Don't call Donald Trump potentially in a second term a comeback. Let's call it what it is. It would be a revenge tour that Trump and his allies have spent years meticulously planning and telling us about. Joining me now to discuss this, Molly Jong-Fast, MSNBC political analyst, host of the Fast Politics podcast, and special correspondent for Vanity Fair. Charles Coleman Jr., MSNBC legal analyst, former prosecutor and host of the Charles Coleman podcast, and Jason Stanley, professor of philosophy at Yale University. He is, of course, the author of Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. It's great to have all three of you in person here. Molly, your reaction to what is happening, I would argue, in plain sight. It may not get the national attention that it gets. People go about their lives. A lot of people thought after 2020 the Trump chapter is over. They stopped paying attention to the votes of the world or the Steve Bannons of the world, thinking we had dodged a bullet. And yet here we are 4 years later, now going back, listening to these tapes, finding these comments where they are telling us in plain sight how they want to remake the American government in their vision.
Yeah, so Project 2025 operates from the theory that the first Trump administration was a failure because they were not able to remake the federal government the way they want to. So a lot of the stuff you're hearing about is this idea of firing all of the federal employees, making them Schedule F. And the goal here is really to shrink the federal government, get rid of things like the Department of Education, which Trump has mused about, and the EPA and NOAA and a lot of the government services that are nonpartisan, scientific, et cetera. And then to get rid of really all the nonpartisan employees in the federal government. Remember, there are tens of thousands of people who work in the federal government, and install them with loyalists. So it's part of it is really to make the federal government an arm of the Trump campaign, right? To make the DOJ serve the pleasure of Donald Trump. And you'll remember the Supreme Court last season gave him this very vague sort of immunity that he can sort of use for anything he wants, and that is so unstructured that he really could just do anything with it.
Jason, the scary part in all of this is, as Molly was saying, they went through the dry run from 2016 to 2020. They now have a blueprint and certainly a playbook. I mean, Jay, you've got Doug Vogt here talking about creating a shadow legal counsel, traumatically affecting bureaucrats, going after them. Everything Trumpism infects becomes infested. You look at his takeover of the Republican Party. We thought at some point the Republican Party would be able to withstand him and stand up to him. That has not happened. He has completely infested the party with his ideology, and it now has become a cult of Donald Trump. And now he wants to do that to the federal government.
Yeah, you said the scary part. I think there are many scary parts here. I agree with Russell Vought that it is a historical moment, but it's not 1776, it's 1932. This is just a perfect blueprint of National Socialism circa 1932. What they're doing is called Gleichschaltung, what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, which is replacement of all agencies by loyalists, by Nazi party members, Nazi party loyalists. So you replace everyone. This tactic, rhetorical tactic, of calling centrist Democrats, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, centrist Democrats, Marxists, is exactly what the National Socialists did. The idea that there's a Marxist takeover of the United States is one of the more absurd ideas floating around today. But what it's going to justify is targeting political opponents as national enemies. And that's what the National Socialists did. The first people they targeted were the Social Democrats, the moderates. And they said they're dangerous Marxists, and they imprisoned them. And that's kind of the playbook that it looks like now.
Okay, Donald Trump is rallying his supporters in Pennsylvania right now, and he seems to really be leaning into his violent rhetoric in the home stretch of this campaign. Listen to what he just said in Pennsylvania just moments ago.
I have a piece of glass over here, and I don't have a piece of glass there. And I have this piece of glass here, but all we have really over here is the fake news, right? And to get me, somebody would have to shoot through the fake news, and I don't mind that so much.
Joining me now is House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi. It's great to see you, Speaker Pelosi, 2 days before the election. And there's so much I want to talk to you about: health care, abortion rights, everything at stake here. I do want to start with those comments because, I mean, your family knows better than just about any family in America the very real consequences of Trump's violent rhetoric. And I just want to get your reaction to what he just said at this rally, what we just played for the audience.
Good morning. Wonderful to be with you again on this weekend before the election. I think that what the ex-president just said is a further indication of his cognitive degeneration. You saw recently when he was talking about whether he chose electrocution or being eaten by sharks. Something's very wrong there. And indicative in it also is diminishing the power of the press, which is the guardian of our freedom in our country. So I think people who might thinking about voting for him have to know that he can't last as president for 4 years with his brain deteriorating at the rate that it is, and it's clearly evident. And they may be voting for President Vance, which would be a horrible thing for our country. You're right. Our family has experienced the violence. Where is Nancy? Where is Nancy? Coming into our house, violating the sanctity of our home, the safety of my husband, looking for me, echoing what was said on January 6th in the Capitol. Where is Nancy? Where is Nancy? Was coming up to punish me for what I had said about Donald Trump.
And I raise it because I think there's a fear people have out there. And we saw some violent language. This wasn't an anomaly. As you and everybody knows out there who's watching, he had some violent language when he was discussing Liz Cheney this week. He suggested he would not be such a war hawk if she had guns trained on her face. His campaign doubled down on that language. He seems to be, I raise this because he seems to know what he's doing. And we've seen this before. Do you think he knows that he's potentially inciting violence against her, violence against you, violence against others who he raises and threatens publicly?
Well, it does have a chilling effect on people who may want to run for office to think that they would be endangering themselves or, more importantly, their families. But I will say this because the Liz Cheney, you think that that would be something that would be so dispositive of people's votes. But there's some people who only vote by the fact that they're very wealthy and they don't want to pay taxes, and their corporations don't want any protections. And that's really sad that their patriotism, they pledge allegiance to their tax return and not to our country and our Constitution and our future. And I will say this, because what you said earlier about a woman's right to choose and all of the things that is implied in that in terms of safety and the rest for women. This is violence against women. He may not know that, but when he says things like, I want to protect women whether they like it or not, that is violence against women. Would you want your son to say that to anyone? Would you want your daughter to be told that? Would you want your husband to say that to you? Whether you like it or not, violence against women. Violence against women's safety by taking away women's, disrespecting women in a life-threatening way in terms of their reproductive health. So women have a lot to lose in this election, but they, more importantly, have a lot to gain by the election of Kamala Harris. And let's talk about her instead of him when we talk about women.
Let's talk about her. And I, what's so exciting, I've a woman in politics. I haven't been a woman in politics as long or as high as you have been, but it is exciting as a woman in politics to see women outvoting men in early voting. Harris is up 20 points among women in Iowa, according to a No poll. This all seems to be getting under Trump's skin. We don't have to talk about him. But what I'm curious for you, you have such a gut for politics. Do you think there are women out there who are not being captured in the polls, who may be voting for Trump? Maybe they're not telling their husband. Maybe they're not telling their Trump family. Because we've seen such a movement on that front, and because people are understandably repulsed by the things Trump is saying and also his policies on women's issues.
Yes, I do. I've been to almost every one of the, recently to every one in the last few weeks, to every one of the states of significance in terms of the Electoral College. And what we see is, of course, women just saying, I'm with you, the Republican women saying to our candidates for the House, because the House is up, is there as well. And let me just tell you something about the House. When we talk about Dobbs and the limitation on women's freedom that that decision was, and that we have to win this election to respect women and the rest. Understand this: when Dobbs passed, we we're still in control. I put on the floor something that would enshrine Roe v. Wade into law in our country. Not one Republican voted for it. Okay, that's who they are. And then I put on the floor something from Kathy Manning of North Carolina, which said women have a right to contraception. Women have a right to contraception. Some of my members said to me, why are you doing that? They're going to vote for this and they'll, look like they've had a different view of things. I said, I know the territory, okay? We put this on the floor. Out of 200, we had the majority to win it, but of the Republicans who voted, 203, 8 voted yes. 8 people, not 8%, 8 members voted, Republicans voted yes, that women have a right to contraception. 195 voted that women do not have a right to contraception. Contraception. So again, women should know how disrespected they are, because these are toadies. The Speaker of the House is a toady of Trump. We will win the House. Hakeem Jeffries will be the Speaker, and that's going to be very important for women and for the future of our country. But also on January 6th, that he will have that gavel. And as I had it before, says she self-servingly, to make sure that we went to the floor of the House to show that we prevailed, democracy prevailed, their insurrection incited by the former president of the United States failed when they were telling me, oh, you have to do this in an undisclosed location with the members bussed in. I said, no, we're not. We're going to the floor of the House to make sure people know. And Hakeem has to have that gavel then, and not only the gavel, but the votes to accept the results of the election, whatever they may be.
Joining us right now, we have Democratic Senator of Maryland, Ben Cardin. Senator, awfully good to see you again, sir. And let's get to the big question. Do you expect Kamala Harris will become the next president of the United States? And if so, what are you seeing that makes you believe it?
Well, Alex, it's good to be with you. Yes, I do believe the vice president will win the presidency and it'll be President Harris-elect come the later this week. What gives me hope is I see the energy that's on the ground. I've been in other states. In my own state of Maryland, we have an interesting race for Senate, and I can see the energy levels here and the commitment levels and the ground game that's being waged on behalf of Vice President Harris. So it gives me a great deal of confidence that the voters are going to elect the vice president as our next president.
Senator, you are the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So if you're right and Kamala Harris becomes the next president, whether it's the evolving situation in Ukraine, the ongoing unrest in the Middle East, how would you, sir, advise her to try and calm these conflicts in ways perhaps the Biden administration has not been able to?
Well, Vice President Harris is really steeped in knowledge on both what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East. I've already had conversations with her in regards to both of these areas. In regards to Ukraine, we've got to stand up against Mr. Putin and his aggression. We've got to stand with Ukraine. They're the front line of our fight to preserve democratic states. We can't let a country take territory through force, and that would not end with Ukraine, and we know that. In regards to the Middle East, we've got to find a path forward for peace in the Middle East, and that means security and isolating Iran and the threat of Iran and its proxies, working with our partners in the region so that the Palestinians and the Israelis can live side by side in peace. And I think the Vice President understands this, has a game plan. I expect you're going to see progress on both Ukraine and on the Middle East under Harris administration.
Okay. I know that you just wrote an op-ed for MSNBC.com, and in it you say that Trump calls himself a political prisoner. That's an insult to these real heroes. Tell me what inspired you to publish this message.
Well, it really is an affront. I saw him try to raise money off the fact that he claims that he's a political prisoner. These human rights defenders globally that put their lives on the line in order to fight for democracy in their country, they have risked their lives. I met one, I know one very well, Vladimir Kara-Murza. I was with him this past week, who was poisoned twice by Mr. Putin and was imprisoned, thought he would die in the Russian prisons just for opposing the war in Ukraine, in Russia. He was released due to the work of the Biden-Harris administration. It's an affront to what they stand for, fighting for the human rights of people of their country. President Trump was tried under an independent judicial system and convicted by his peers in a jury trial. And to compare what he's going through with what these human rights defenders that have been political prisoners around the world is just an affront to the decency and courage of these individuals.
Well said. Let's move to the Democrats, who are staring down a fierce battle to keep control of the Senate with critical races spread out across this country. We know, sir, that you're retiring, but what are the stakes for your party? What happens if Republicans take over the Senate, including control of key committees like yours?
Well, I'm very hopeful that Democrats will maintain control of the United States Senate, and we're going to do our job in Maryland with the election of Angela Alsobrooks. So I know we have competitive races. We also have some of the Republicans that are up for election that we hope to make some progress on it. Make no mistake about it, the control of the Senate is the ability to control the agenda of the United States Senate. And we saw under Republican control what they did in regards to President Obama's judicial selections, including Merrick Garland not even getting a vote in the United States Senate for the Supreme Court. So we know what's at stake, and I think the people of this country knows what's at stake. And if you believe in the Democratic agenda, if you want President Harris to be able to get her agenda through, we also need to keep control of the United States Senate.
And I'm sure you've been following all these races very closely, but which of your colleagues that's now locked in tight races do you think will end up surprising us most on election night? Is there a name that sticks out for you?
Well, I think we have some of our challengers. What's happening in Texas, what's happening in Florida, what's happening in some of the other states. I think you're going to see some surprises there. I think our Democratic incumbents are going to do well. I know they have some very tough races, but we're optimistic. We've all been working together to make sure that all of our incumbents win, and perhaps we can pick up a seat or two.
Okay, and so that means Allred, Mucarsel-Powell, you're looking at specifically that have a good shot. Is there a particular Democratic senator that you're most concerned for due to a very competitive race?
Well, obviously, we recognize that Jon Tester has a really tough race in Montana. We also recognize Ohio is a tough state for Sherrod Brown. We know Tammy Baldwin's running a great campaign in Wisconsin, but that's a tough state. Jackie Rosen in Nevada. These are states that we recognize. Of course, Bob Casey in the key state of Pennsylvania. These are all challenging races. We think we have the right candidates, and we think we have the right message, and we're optimistic we can win these races.
All right. Well, Senator Cardin, I want to thank you not only for your time today, but also for your 18 years, over 3 terms serving in the U.S. Senate. Well done, sir, and I've enjoyed talking with you, I think, pretty much throughout all 18 of them. So thank you so much for all that. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Alex. It's always good to be with you, and thanks for what you do.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, here we are. We have just 2 days left in the craziest campaign season most of us can remember, at least that I can remember. I mean, 4 indictments, 34 felony counts, 1 switch at the top of the Democratic ticket, and 2 assassination attempts later, we are now standing on the edge of what feels like a very tall cliff. And one of the truly remarkable things about this race is that with so much volatility, with dozens of moments that we all felt like maybe this is the determining factor right now, the race still looks remarkably close. The news cycle surprised us constantly throughout, but there were a few polling moves that really surprised us that much in terms of massive movement. That is until last night. And before I show you these numbers, and you may have seen them, but you should know where they come from. And they come from Ann Seltzer, the widely respected, incredibly accurate historically pollster at the Des Moines Register in Iowa. The phrase gold standard gets thrown around a lot in polling, but I can tell you, Ann Seltzer is actually the gold standard. I mean, Ann Seltzer just gets it right much more than she gets it wrong. That makes her the gold standard. In 2016, Seltzer was out on a limb predicting that Donald Trump would beat Hillary Clinton in Iowa by 7 points. Guess what? Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 9. In 2020, her final poll before the election had Trump up 7, and he ended up winning the state by 8. Well, in her final poll before this election, released just last night, Ann Seltzer's Des Moines Register poll sent a bit of a mini earthquake around last night across the political world because it showed Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump by 3 points in Iowa. And that lead is fueled by a massive 20-point advantage among women in that poll. Now, there are definitely outliers in polling. We all know that. That's probably one of the stories, could be one of the stories of this election. And this poll could be an outlier. I'm certainly not suggesting that Kamala Harris is about to run away with Iowa. The campaign isn't betting on that either. What I am saying is that Ann Seltzer is very good at this. And even if she is close to correct on this one, it is very good news for Kamala Harris, in part because it shows that she's doing quite well with a white rural electorate. And here's the thing. It's not a poll happening in a vacuum either. I mean, this one poll out of Iowa isn't the only thing the Harris campaign is feeling good about right now with 2 days left. Women are outpacing men in casting early ballots by 9 points nationwide, by 13 points right now in the crucial state of Pennsylvania. Democrats also have a 10-point enthusiasm advantage over Republicans, according to Gallup. And there are signs that late deciding voters are breaking for Harris, too. According to a New York Times poll just out this morning as well, among the 8% of voters who said they had only recently decided on their vote, Harris wins the group by double digits. That's called closing strong. And that's just a sample of the information out there. And look, if you are feeling overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information, analysis, stories, data points, hot takes, whatever it may be, that may or may not tell you what the result will actually be, I've been doing this a very long time, and I feel the exact same way. The truth is we just don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be on Tuesday. And I'm going to talk to Pete Buttigieg and Nancy Pelosi today, 2 of the smartest minds in the Democratic Party. And guess what? They don't know what's going to happen, the outcome's going to be either. But right now, for everything we don't know yet, there is a lot we do know about the choice and the stakes of this election. And for me, as crazy and disorienting as this campaign season has been, I hope that these final few days have provided the country with a level of clarity. I mean, this week, Trump said he'll protect women, quote, whether they like it or not. Whether they like it or not. Now, here is how I heard that. As a creepy, condescending threat from a guy who was himself found liable for sexual abuse, who said he could grab women because when you're a star, they let you do that sort of thing, who appointed the 3 Supreme Court justices who overturned a woman's right to make choices about their own health care. That's how I heard it. And hearing that kind of thing might be clarifying for women in these final days. I certainly hope it is. Trump also said this week that RFK Jr., one of the country's leading vaccine conspiracy theorists, is, quote, going to work on health and women's health, adding, quote, he can do anything he wants. That prospect definitely focuses the mind, or it should. Oh, and he also fantasized out loud about watching one of his fiercest female critics, Liz Cheney, standing in front of a firing squad.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
I'd say that's awfully clarifying for anyone who doesn't want to live in a country where their leader, as Cheney herself put it, threatens those who speak against them with death. I mean, that's all how Donald Trump is closing out his campaign. Controlling women, letting conspiracy theorists run wild with the nation's health, fantasizing about the death of a female critic. I mean, that Iowa poll I showed you is shocking in some ways, but should a 20-point lead with women in any state be all that surprising? Is it really any great wonder why women are voting early at a faster pace than men? Why late deciders may be breaking Harris's way? Should we really be that surprised? Look, this race is going to be close. We don't know how it will end. I'm going to keep saying that. But at the close of this campaign, at least the American people are seeing the core of Donald Trump. They're seeing who he really is, what he really intends to do. And he is who you think he is. He will use power how he has told us for years he will use power. We're a few days out, and there is not a shred of ambiguity left. So am I concerned? Am I anxious that there aren't enough people in those battleground states who see this choice for what it is? Of course I am. But 2 days out from this election, I remain hopeful that there are. Starting us off today is Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. He's joining us from Michigan in his personal capacity. It's great to see you. I have to start with this brand new poll out of Iowa, a state you won in a Democratic caucus back in 2020. We all remember that. You also did some local media in Iowa last week, which sent the internet a spur. What do you make of that poll, knowing Iowa as you know it, knowing the electorate as you know it?
Well, yeah, I spent a lot of time in Iowa, and on one level, it's remarkable, and on another level, I could see it. Look, Iowa is full of people who think for themselves, folks who are not afraid to cross party lines, who usually vote this way but decide to vote that way based on the candidates. And, you know, it tracks with the fact that we've seen, as far as I can tell, an unprecedented number of Republicans out there saying, hey, this time you got to vote for the Democrats. So, look, it's only one poll. You don't want to get carried away. But if you do live and breathe this stuff, you know that this might be the most famous name in polling, certainly in Iowa, and somebody who's extremely rigorous. So I think what that tells us is not just what could happen in Iowa, but what is happening across the country. And I've got to tell you, and I say this in all humility because nobody really knows anything for sure until the election ends, but it is consistent with how it feels right now on the ground in Michigan. I'm right now at a field office in Ingham County, been crisscrossing the state for the last day and a half, and there's an extraordinary amount of energy. We just kicked off a canvass with dozens, probably about 100 volunteers getting ready to go out, knock on doors, and that momentum is palpable. It's real, and I hope if we all do our job and make sure we talk to every voter we can think of, both about how to vote and about whether to vote, I think this could propel a real victory on Tuesday.
Sometimes energy tells you a lot. A lot of times it tells you a lot, especially in the final days. And, you know, to your point, I mean, I don't think the Harris campaign is counting on Iowa. No one should think that. But Michigan is an example of this, certainly Wisconsin, Minnesota, states around there. There are some demographics where she has been working to make up ground. Obviously, she's got a huge lead among women, but Iowa's a big white rural state. It shows to me that she can do well, perhaps, among that demographic. What is your takeaway of that in terms of how it could play into other Midwestern states? And there's certainly swaths of Michigan that fall into those demographics as well.
Well, you know, Donald Trump broke almost every promise that he made, but he did manage to keep a couple. And one of them was that he promised to destroy a woman's right to choose. That was a promise that he made to the far religious right. And then he kept that promise and destroyed that right. Every American woman had a nationwide right to choose before he came to power, and now don't. And that's an enormously important thing that, look, I think not just women, but the men who care about women and about freedom in this country should be motivated by. So it's something that I think you do see reflected. If anything, I would guess it may be a little bit hard to capture in the polls, just how strong of a force that is. Women as a force really helped change things in 2022 when we had election results in the midterms that kind of went against the laws of political physics. Usually you don't see Democrats do that well when there's a Democratic president. But I think that had a lot to do with it. Right here in Michigan, I was proud in 2022 to vote for the ballot initiative to secure the right to choose for women here in this state. But that ought to be a national right. The whole point of a constitutional right is that it applies to everybody everywhere in the country. And I think about, I'm pretty sure my mom is watching us right now. And she and I want to make sure that my daughter has as many rights or more than my mom had. And we're all in this together to make sure that's a reality. And that starts with making sure Kamala Harris is the next president of the United States.
I think a lot of people are wondering, what can they do? How should they be talking in these final days? You've responded to some recent headlines about Trump, like about his rally at Madison Square Garden, by saying it's bait. In other words, it's a distraction, and we should focus on the positives of Harris and less on the negatives of Trump. That's always a tricky balance, not giving Trump oxygen while still holding him accountable. And I'm just wondering, as you're out there on the trail over the next couple of days, how are you balancing that? How do you hope people balance that, who are out there speaking publicly and privately about the choice here?
Yeah, it is a tough balance because he does things that are so outrageous, so wrong, so dangerous that we have to respond. But I think the more we're talking about him, the less we're talking about you, the voter, the American family that has so much on the line. And I do think we need to be out there reminding folks that it's not about chasing the latest silly thing he did or disturbing thing that he did or said online. It's about making sure that we make it more affordable to live in this country, that we restore a woman's right to choose, that we grow our economy, and remind everybody why they personally will be better off with her in charge. There's one other message that I think is important, and it is something that is kind of evoked by all of the craziness and some of the ugliness of his campaign, which is I think there's a lot of people, left, right, and center in this country, who are just yearning for a more normal future, one with, frankly, has a more normal Republican Party. A vote for Kamala Harris is a vote for politics not to be punching you in the face every day, every time you turn on the news, because we can get back to a way of doing things in this country where, of course, we're not always going to agree, but it's not this constant in-your-face death match that it's felt like, whether he's president or whether he's candidate. And I got to tell you, if he leads the Republican Party to defeat the third time in a row, 2020, the 2022 midterms, and now, then it will finally, I think, lead us to a moment where the Republican Party finds some way to part ways with what him and everything he represents. And we can sometimes, just sometimes, like at Thanksgiving dinner, maybe leave politics on the back burner.